Thunder rolled across the vast Wyoming sky as Julia Hawkins clutched the edge of her bed frame, a scream tearing from her throat. The abandoned homestead creaked and groaned against the relentless storm outside, rain hammering the roof like 1,000 angry fists. She was alone, miles from the nearest settlement of Val Verde, with nothing but the howling wind for company, and her baby was coming. "Not now," she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. "Please, not now." But her child had other plans. Julia had been on her way to San Francisco when her husband Thomas was killed by outlaws 3 days prior. They'd attacked their wagon on the lonely trail, taking everything of value and leaving Thomas bleeding in the dust. Julia had somehow managed to escape with just their horse and the clothes on her back. 8 months pregnant and desperate, she'd sought shelter in this abandoned homestead when the first drops of rain began to fall. Now, as lightning split the sky, she realized she'd have to deliver this baby alone. Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Julia bit down on a rolled piece of fabric torn from her petticoat, trying to muffle her screams. The storm outside seemed to mirror her agony, reaching a crescendo just as she gave one final, desperate push. Then, miraculously, a tiny cry joined the cacophony of the tempest. "Oh God," Julia sobbed, reaching down to cradle the slippery, squirming infant against her chest. "Hello, my darling, hello." It was a boy, small but strong, lunged with a shock of dark hair like his father's. Despite her exhaustion, despite the blood and the pain, Julia felt a fierce surge of love unlike anything she'd ever known. Using her teeth and trembling hands, she managed to sever the cord and wrap her son in a scrap of blanket she'd found in the cabin. The storm continued to rage as Julia held her baby close, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep. They were alone, without supplies, without help. How would they survive? As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. Julia drifted in and out of consciousness, her newborn clutched protectively to her breast. She barely registered the sound of hoofbeats approaching or the cautious creak of the cabin door. Rifle at the ready, Ranger, Mustang, Riley Adams stepped cautiously into the abandoned homestead. The Texas Ranger had been tracking a gang of rustlers across the territory when the storm hit, forcing him to seek shelter. He'd spotted smoke from the chimney of this supposedly empty cabin and approached with caution. Outlaws were known to hole up in such places. What he found instead stole the breath from his lungs. A young woman lay on a blood-soaked mattress, deathly pale but breathing, with a tiny, red-faced infant nestled against her. The scene hit him like a physical blow. "Madam," he called softly, lowering his rifle. "Madam, can you hear me?" Julia's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with fear. She instinctively curled around her baby, trying to shield him. "Don't be afraid," Riley said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm Ranger Riley Adams. I'm here to help." "My baby," Julia whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, help my baby." Riley moved closer, kneeling beside the bed. The woman was in bad shape, exhausted, likely dehydrated, possibly feverish. The infant seemed all right, though small and wrapped in nothing but a thin scrap of cloth. "What's your name, madam?" he asked gently, removing his bandana and dipping it in his canteen to wipe her forehead. "Julia," she managed. "Julia Hawkins. This is—" She looked down at her son. "This is Thomas, after his father." Riley nodded, noticing the absence of a wedding ring but the pale band of skin where one had recently been. There was a story here, but now wasn't the time. "Well, Miss Julia, you and little Thomas are in luck. I've got supplies on my horse, and I've delivered my fair share of foals and calves in my time." He tried to smile reassuringly. "Not quite the same thing, I reckon, but I know enough to help you both. Over the next few hours, Riley worked tirelessly. He built up the fire, heated water, and used his limited medical supplies to clean both mother and child. He found Julia some jerky from his saddlebag, insisted she drink plenty of water, and fashioned a better swaddling cloth for Thomas from his spare shirt. As evening approached again, Riley looked down at the tiny boy in Julia's arms and frowned. "He can't keep sleeping in your arms, madam. You need rest yourself." He gazed around the sparse cabin thoughtfully. "This place needs some work, but there's decent timber outside. If you don't mind, I'd like to build the little fella a proper place to sleep." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Riley's weathered face softened. "Out here, madam, we look after each other. It's the only way to survive." He tipped his hat and stepped outside. Throughout the night, as Julia drifted between sleep and wakefulness, she heard the steady sounds of sawing, hammering, and sanding. By the pale light of dawn, Riley returned, carrying a small, sturdy wooden cradle. "It ain't fancy," he said, setting it down beside her bed, "but it'll keep him safe and comfortable." Julia stared at the simple, beautifully crafted cradle, then up at the tall ranger with his kind eyes and weathered face. In that moment, something shifted in her heart, a tiny spark of hope rekindling in the darkness of her grief. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." Riley Adams nodded awkwardly, unused to such raw gratitude. He didn't tell her that, as he'd worked through the night, something had shifted in him too, a protective feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his wife and child to cholera 5 years before. He didn't say that the sight of her holding that baby had broken something open inside him that he'd thought permanently sealed. Instead, he simply said, "You both should rest. I'll keep watch." And so began their unusual arrangement. Riley insisted on staying another day to make sure Julia and Thomas were stable. One day stretched into 2, then 3. He hunted game, repaired the cabin's leaking roof, and chopped enough firewood to last a month. Each evening, he'd sit by the fire with Julia, learning her story, how she and Thomas had been heading west for a new start, how the outlaws had attacked, how she'd fled and found this abandoned homestead just before the storm hit. "I'm sorry about your husband," Riley said one night, a week after he'd found them. "No one should have to go through that." Julia looked down at her sleeping son. "I still can't believe he's gone. We were childhood sweethearts back in Missouri, married right out of school." Her voice caught. "This wasn't how it was supposed to be." Riley's eyes darkened with understanding. "Life rarely follows our plans, Miss Julia." He hesitated before adding, "I lost my wife and daughter to cholera 5 years ago, thought my life was over too." Julia looked up sharply. "I'm so sorry." "What was her name?" "Your daughter, Sarah," Riley said softly. "She was 3, spitting image of her mama." They sat in companionable silence after that, 2 souls who understood loss in ways most others couldn't. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. 2 weeks after Riley found them, Julia was well enough to move around the cabin, though still weak. Riley had begun making plans to escort them to Val Verde once she was stronger. "The town's growing fast," he explained as he mended a tear in his saddle. "There's a doctor there, and plenty of good folks who'd help a widow and her child." Julia felt a strange pang at the thought of leaving the cabin, of saying goodbye to Riley. In just 2 weeks, his steady presence had become a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you take us to Val Verde." Riley's hand stilled on his work. "Head back to my rangering, I suppose. Those rustlers won't catch themselves." "Do you ever think about settling down again?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Riley looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers across the room. "I didn't," he said slowly. Not until recently. The air in the cabin seemed suddenly charged. Thomas chose that moment to wake with a hungry cry, breaking the tension. Julia turned away, her cheeks flushed, to tend to her son. Later that night, as Julia nursed Thomas in the rocking chair Riley had repaired, she heard him outside, talking softly to his horse. Through the open window, his words drifted to her. "What am I doing, Thunder? Getting attached to a widow woman and her baby. Fool move, old son. Fool move." Julia's heart twisted. She understood his reservation, she felt it too. It was too soon after Thomas's death to contemplate feelings for another man. And yet, in the midst of tragedy, something undeniable was growing between them. The next morning, Riley announced he needed to ride into Val Verde for supplies. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. "Keep the door barred while I'm gone." Julia nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of panic at being left alone. "We'll be fine," she assured him, bouncing Thomas gently in her arms. "Won't we, little one?" Riley hesitated, then reached out to brush a finger along the baby's cheek. "You're a brave pair, that's certain." His eyes lingered on Julia's face a moment too long before he turned and mounted his horse. Julia watched him ride away, Thomas cradled against her shoulder, feeling strangely bereft. In just 2 weeks, Riley Adams had become essential to her world in a way she never could have anticipated. True to his word, Riley returned by sunset, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. He'd brought flour, sugar, coffee, and even a bolt of soft flannel for baby clothes. Most surprising of all, he pulled out a small wooden box with a hinged lid. "What's this?" Julia asked as he handed it to her. "Open it," Riley urged, an unusual nervousness in his voice. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. Julia gasped, touching it reverently. "Riley, I can't accept this. It's too much." He shook his head. "It was my mother's. She'd want you to have it something pretty after all you've been through." Julia closed her hand around the locket, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for the emotion swelling in her chest. That night, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, they sat by the fire drinking coffee. Riley seemed preoccupied, turning his cup in his hands. "I ran into some trouble in town," he finally said, his voice low. "The bartender recognized me, said there's been talk of a ranger asking questions about rustled cattle. Word gets around." Julia set down her cup. "The men you've been tracking, they've got friends in Val Verde." Riley's jaw tightened. "Might not be safe for us there after all." "Then where will we go?" The question hung in the air between them. Riley met her gaze steadily. "I've been thinking on that. There's a town called Sweetwater about 100 miles east, smaller than Val Verde but growing. Got a school teacher, doctor, proper law. My brother owns land nearby." He hesitated. "It would be a good place to raise a child." Julia's heart raced at the implication. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we think about the future, Julia." Riley leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I know it's fast. I know you're still grieving. But out here, life moves at its own pace." "What exactly are you proposing, Ranger Adams?" Julia whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I'm proposing we go to Sweetwater together, not as strangers or even friends, but as family, if you're willing." He swallowed hard. "I've grown mighty fond of you and that boy. I think we could build something good together." Julia's eyes filled with tears. 2 weeks ago, she'd been certain her life was over. Now this good, steady man was offering her a second chance. "I can't replace Thomas," she said softly. "I wouldn't ask you to forget him, just like I'll never forget Sarah or my Elizabeth. They're part of us." Riley reached across the table to take her hand. "But maybe there's room in our hearts for something new." Julia looked at their joined hands, then over at her sleeping son. She thought of the cradle Riley had built that first night, how it had been his first instinct to provide, to protect. "Yes," she said finally, a smile breaking through her tears. "I think there might be." 3 days later, they packed their meager belongings onto Riley's horse, and the old mare Julia had arrived with. The abandoned homestead had served its purpose, sheltering them through crisis and new beginnings. Julia looked back at it as they rode away, the cradle secured carefully to the packhorse. "Thank you," she whispered to the weathered building. The journey to Sweetwater was slow, with frequent stops for Thomas's needs. Riley was ever vigilant, wary of the rustlers he'd been tracking. They camped under the stars, and Julia marveled at how comfortable it felt, this makeshift family finding its way together. On the third night of their journey, as they sat beside their small fire with Thomas asleep nearby, Riley produced a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "If we're to arrive in Sweetwater as a family, perhaps we should make it official beforehand." His usually confident voice held a note of uncertainty. "Unless you'd rather wait." Julia looked at the ring, then at this man who'd saved her life and her son's, who'd built a cradle by morning light and offered his heart when she needed it most. "I don't want to wait," she said softly. "Life's too uncertain for waiting." Riley slipped the ring onto her finger, and under the vast Wyoming sky, they spoke simple vows to one another, promises of care, respect, and devotion. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined for themselves, but it held a rightness that neither could deny. Later, as Julia lay wrapped in Riley's protective embrace, she whispered, "Do you think they'd mind? Thomas and your Elizabeth?" Riley was quiet for a long moment. "I think they'd want us to find happiness again," he finally said. "To take care of each other and that little boy." Julia nodded against his chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. They weren't tears of grief this time, but of gratitude for second chances and unexpected blessings. The next morning, they continued their journey with renewed purpose, now truly a family bound by choice rather than just circumstance. They avoided the main trails, Riley's caution never wavering. Each night, he would hold Thomas while Julia rested, marveling at the tiny fingers that wrapped so trustingly around his own. "He's getting stronger every day," Riley observed on their 5th night on the trail. "Gonna be a fine horseman someday, I reckon." Julia smiled, watching them together. "You sound like a proud papa already." Riley looked up, his expression serious. "I'd like to be, if that's all right with you, not replacing his real father, but—" He struggled to find the right words. "His real father is gone," Julia said gently, "but you're here. You're the father he'll know and love." She took his hand. "And you're the man I've chosen to build a life with. That makes you his papa in every way that matters." Riley's eyes shone with emotion in the firelight. He bent to press a kiss to Thomas's forehead, then leaned across to kiss Julia softly. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "A family, a purpose beyond the badge." "Neither did I," Julia confessed. "After Thomas died, I couldn't see any future at all." They held each other's gaze across the flames, acknowledging the unlikely miracle of their meeting, how tragedy and chance had converged to bring them together in that storm-battered cabin. On the 7th day of travel, they crested a hill and saw Sweetwater spread below them in the valley, a collection of wooden buildings with a white church steeple rising prominently in the center. Smoke curled from chimneys, and even from a distance, they could see people moving about the main street. "It's beautiful," Julia breathed, adjusting Thomas in her arms. Riley nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My brother's place is just beyond that ridge to the east. Good water, fertile land." He glanced at her. "Room to build something of our own if you'd like." Julia's heart swelled at the possibilities stretching before them. I'd like that very much. They rode into town late that afternoon, drawing curious glances from the locals. A tall, broad-shouldered man who bore a striking resemblance to Riley emerged from the general store and stopped in his tracks. "Riley Adams, is that you?" he called, striding toward them. Riley dismounted, grinning widely. "In the flesh, Robert." The brothers embraced heartily before Riley turned to introduce Julia and Thomas. "This is my wife, Julia, and our son, Thomas." Julia noted the surprise that flickered across Robert's face at the word wife, but he recovered quickly, tipping his hat to her with genuine warmth. "Madam, it's a pleasure, and this little fellow too." He peered at Thomas with a broad smile. "You've been holding out on me, brother. Last letter I got, you were still chasing outlaws across the territory." Riley exchanged a glance with Julia, a world of understanding passing between them. "It's a long story, Robert. One best told over a hot meal and strong coffee." Robert laughed. "Well, you're in luck. Martha's got a stew on that'll make you weep with gratitude. Come on home with me, all of you." As they followed Robert to his wagon, Julia felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were being welcomed, not questioned. In this place, they could simply be a family, their unusual beginning known only to themselves. Robert's home was a substantial farmhouse surrounded by fields of wheat and corn. His wife Martha, a plump, cheerful woman with kind eyes, embraced Julia as if they were long-lost sisters. "Any wife of Riley's is family to us," she declared, cooing over Thomas. "And this handsome boy, my stars, what a blessing." That night, after the most satisfying meal Julia had eaten in weeks, the two couples sat around the kitchen table while Thomas slept peacefully in a borrowed cradle. Riley and Julia took turns telling their story, edited in places for simplicity, but honest in its essence. They spoke of Julia's loss, of the storm that had brought Thomas into the world, of Riley finding them and building the cradle. "And now here we are," Riley concluded, taking Julia's hand. "Looking to start fresh." Martha dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "If that isn't the good Lord's work, I don't know what is." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That piece of land adjoining mine is still available. 160 acres, good timber, creek running through it, cabins basic but sound." He looked at his brother. "Could be yours by week's end if you're interested." Riley looked to Julia, a question in his eyes. "It sounds perfect," she said softly. Later, as they prepared for bed in the guest room, Riley pulled Julia into his arms. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "It's not too fast." Settling here, taking that land, Julia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Nothing about our story has followed the usual pace, Riley. Why start now?" She looked up at him, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. "I've never been more sure of anything." The next morning, Riley and Robert rode out to inspect the neighboring property, while Martha taught Julia how to make her famous biscuits. Thomas lay contentedly in his borrowed cradle, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams streaming through the kitchen window. "He's a remarkably good baby," Martha observed, kneading dough with practiced hands. "Must take after his mama." Julia smiled, touched by the simple acceptance. "He's been through so much already. Sometimes I worry about the future raising him without." She trailed off. Martha dusted flour from her hands and faced Julia squarely. "Without his birth father, child, let me tell you something. Riley Adams is one of the finest men I've ever known. He'll love that boy as his own already does, from what I can see." She patted Julia's arm. "And you delivered a baby alone during a thunderstorm. If that doesn't prove your mettle, I don't know what would." Julia blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the older woman's confidence. "Thank you for welcoming us, for everything." "Nonsense. That's what family does." Martha returned to her biscuits. Now tell me what you'll need for that cabin. I've got linens and kitchenware to spare." By week's end, true to Robert's prediction, Riley and Julia were the proud owners of 160 acres of Wyoming territory. The cabin, while basic, was indeed sound 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, a hand dug well nearby, and a small stable for their horses. The original owners had left behind a roughly built table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame that Riley insisted on replacing immediately. "I'll build us proper furniture," he declared as they surveyed their new home. "A bed that doesn't creak, a table big enough for company." He gazed around thoughtfully. "And when Thomas gets bigger, we'll add another room." Julia stepped into his embrace, Thomas sleeping against her shoulder. "It's perfect, Riley. It's home." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Riley threw himself into improving the cabin, adding shelves, building a rocking chair for Julia, reinforcing the roof before winter came. Julia planted a small vegetable garden with seeds Martha had provided, learned to milk the cow Robert had insisted on giving them as a housewarming gift, and turned the humble cabin into a home with simple curtains and carefully arranged wildflowers. Thomas thrived under their care, growing plumper and more alert by the day. He was a sunny baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss. Riley spent hours just watching him, marveling at each tiny development. "He rolled over today," Riley announced one evening, bursting into the cabin with an armload of firewood. "All by himself, right there on the blanket while I was mending the fence." Julia laughed at his enthusiasm. "Next he'll be breaking horses and roping cattle." "Wouldn't surprise me a bit," Riley said proudly, setting down the wood and scooping Thomas up from his cradle. "Got a natural seat, this one." As summer turned to fall, they settled into a comfortable routine. Riley worked the land, and occasionally rode with the local sheriff when extra hands were needed. Julia kept house, tended the garden, and began taking in mending from town folks to earn extra money. On Sundays, they attended services at the white-steepled church, where Thomas was duly admired and Julia's pies became legendary at social gatherings. They made friends the doctor and his bookish wife, the blacksmith and his large, boisterous family, the schoolteacher who insisted Thomas would be her star pupil one day. Slowly, the pain of their past losses receded, not forgotten but no longer defining their every moment. One crisp October evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple, Riley took Julia's hand. "I got a letter today," he said quietly, "from my ranger captain." Julia's stomach clenched with sudden fear. "They want you back." Riley shook his head. "No, they caught those rustlers I was tracking 3 counties over trying to move the cattle across the state line." He squeezed her hand. "It's over, Julia. That chapter's closed for good." Relief flooded through her. "So no more rangering." "No more rangering," he confirmed. "I'm just a farmer now, a husband, a father." His voice softened on the last word, still filled with wonder after all these months. Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Are you happy with that, this simple life?" Riley turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the deepening twilight. "Happier than I ever thought possible again." He kissed her softly. "Thank you for giving me back my future." That night, as Thomas slept soundly in the cradle that had traveled with them from that storm-battered cabin to their new home, Riley and Julia loved each other with a tender passion that spoke of gratitude and promise. Afterward, tangled together in the handcrafted bed Riley had indeed built to not creak, Julia felt a sense of completion that once seemed impossible. "I think I might be ready," she whispered into the darkness. "Ready for what?" Riley asked, his voice drowsy. "To try for another baby. A brother or sister for Thomas." Riley propped himself up on one elbow, his expression suddenly alert in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Are you certain? It hasn't even been a year since—" "I'm certain," Julia interrupted gently. "Life moves at its own pace out here, remember. And our family feels unfinished somehow." Riley gathered her close, his kiss conveying everything words couldn't express. "Then we'll just have to do something about that, Mrs. Adams." Winter came early that year, blanketing their land in pristine white. The cabin, now insulated with extra chinking between the logs and boasting glass windows Robert had helped install, remained cozy despite the howling wind outside. Thomas took his first tentative steps just before Christmas, lurching from the table to Riley's outstretched arms with a triumphant giggle. "That's it, son," Riley cheered, swinging the boy up into the air. "Knew you had it in you." Julia watched them, one hand pressed unconsciously to her stomach. She hadn't told Riley yet about her suspicions, wanted to be certain first, but the familiar symptoms were unmistakable. By next Christmas, Thomas would indeed have that sibling they'd talked about. On Christmas Eve, their small cabin filled with warmth and light. Robert and Martha came for dinner, bringing gifts and more food than they could possibly eat. The doctor and his wife joined them later for hot cider and carols around the fire. Thomas, overwhelmed by all the attention, finally fell asleep in Martha's ample lap, his chubby fingers still clutching the wooden horse Riley had carved for him. After everyone had gone and Thomas was tucked safely in his cradle, Julia and Riley exchanged their own gifts. She'd made him a new shirt, finer than any he'd owned before, with careful stitching and bone buttons she'd saved up to buy from the general store. He presented her with a small, intricately carved jewelry box. "Open it," he urged, just as he had with the locket months before. Inside, nestled on a cushion of velvet, lay a wedding ring, a proper one with a small but brilliant diamond catching the firelight. "Riley," she gasped. "How did you been saving since we got here?" he admitted. "Had it sent from Denver. Wanted you to have something worthy of you." He took her hand, removing the simple band she'd worn since their makeshift ceremony on the trail. "Julia Hawkins Adams, will you marry me?" Again, but proper this time, in the church with all our friends watching. Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Riley slipped the diamond onto her finger, then pulled her close for a kiss that promised forever. "I have something for you too," Julia whispered when they finally drew apart. "Something that can't be wrapped." Riley's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm having another baby," she said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. "Come summer, there'll be 4 of us." For a moment Riley simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, this strong, stoic man fell to his knees before her, pressing his face against her middle as his shoulders shook with silent tears. "Thank you," he whispered over and over. "Thank you." Julia stroked his hair, understanding the depth of his emotion. This child would be theirs from the beginning, a symbol of their union, their future. Not replacing Thomas, who would always be precious, but expanding the love that had found them both when they least expected it. Their church wedding took place on New Year's Day, 1873, a fresh beginning for a new year. Julia wore a dress of deep blue velvet that Martha had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Riley stood tall in a new suit, Thomas balanced on his hip. The entire town turned out to witness their vows, followed by a celebration at Robert and Martha's farm that lasted well into the evening. As spring arrived, bringing new life to their land, Julia's condition became obvious to all. The women of Sweetwater rallied around her with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and regular visits to ensure she wasn't overtaxing herself. Riley grew even more protective, insisting on hiring a local boy to help with the heavier farm work so he could spend more time near the cabin. "I'm not made of glass, you know," Julia teased one afternoon as he rushed to take a basket of laundry from her arms. "Just making sure you and the little one are taken care of," Riley replied, unashamed of his hovering. "Besides, I missed all this with Thomas. Don't want to miss a moment this time." Julia's heart melted at his words. It was true he'd missed the early days, the anticipation, the planning. This time they would experience it all together. As her time drew near, Riley became increasingly anxious. The memory of finding Julia after her solitary ordeal with Thomas haunted him. He arranged for the doctor to check on her weekly and made sure Martha understood she might be called at any hour. "You're worse than a cat on hot bricks," Robert laughed during one of his visits. "Julia's strong as they come, brother. Stop your fretting." But Riley couldn't help himself. Each night he would fall asleep with his hand resting protectively on Julia's rounded belly, as if he could guard mother and child even in slumber. On a sweltering July evening, just as they were finishing supper, Julia felt the first contraction. Unlike the panic that had gripped her during Thomas's birth, this time she felt only a calm readiness. "It's time," she told Riley, who immediately turned pale beneath his tan. "I'll get the doctor," he said, already reaching for his hat. Julia caught his hand. "No need to rush. First babies come slow, second ones slower still sometimes. We have time." But Riley insisted, and within the hour both the doctor and Martha were settled in the cabin. Thomas, now nearly 18 months old and full of boundless energy, was taken to stay with Robert while Julia labored. This birth proved remarkably different from her first. With experienced help, clean surroundings, and Riley's unwavering support, Julia found the process almost peaceful. She walked the cabin floor between contractions, breathed through the pain as Martha instructed, and drew strength from Riley's steady presence. As dawn broke on July 5, 1873, their daughter slipped into the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "A girl," the doctor announced, placing the squirming infant on Julia's chest. "And a fine, healthy one at that." Riley stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the tiny red face with an expression of awe. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Just perfect. What will you call her?" Martha asked, already bustling about with warm water and clean linens. Julia looked up at Riley, a question in her eyes. They discussed names but hadn't settled on one. "Sarah Elizabeth," Riley said softly, "if that's all right with you." Julia's eyes filled with tears of understanding. Sarah for his lost daughter, Elizabeth for his first wife, honoring the past while embracing their future. "It's beautiful," she agreed. "Sarah Elizabeth Adams." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Strong name for a strong girl. Congratulations to you both." Later, after everyone had gone and the new family was alone, Riley sat on the edge of the bed with Sarah cradled carefully in his arms. The expression on his face was one Julia would remember for the rest of her life, wonder mixed with fierce protectiveness and boundless love. "I never thought I'd hold my own daughter again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never thought I'd have this chance." Julia reached out to touch his arm. "Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them." Riley looked from the sleeping infant to his wife. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret giving me yours." The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. Their farm prospered, allowing them to build a larger house as their family grew. Thomas, sturdy and curious like his stepfather, showed an early aptitude for horses and spent hours at Riley's side learning the ways of the land. Sarah, with her mother's golden hair and her father's determined spirit, became the family mediator, wise beyond her years from an early age. Two more children joined their brood, James Robert in 1875 and Abigail Martha in 1878, completing the family Riley and Julia had built from the ashes of their separate sorrows. They raised their children with stories of courage and second chances, never hiding the unusual circumstances of their beginning, but focusing instead on the love that had brought them together. On the 10th anniversary of the night Riley found Julia and Thomas in that storm-battered cabin, the family gathered around the fireplace in their comfortable home. The original cradle Riley had built stood in a place of honor in the corner of the parlor, now serving as a toy chest for the younger children. "Tell us the story again, Pa," Thomas requested, now a lanky 11-year-old with his mother's eyes and a confident bearing that mirrored Riley's. "About the night you found us." Riley exchanged a smile with Julia across the room. It had become a family tradition, this retelling, a reminder of how their journey began. "Well," Riley started, settling back in his chair, "it was the worst storm Wyoming had seen in 20 years. Thunder so loud it shook the mountains, lightning splitting the sky like it was angry at the world." The children listened in rapt attention, even though they'd heard the tale countless times before. Sarah, now 9, cuddled against Julia's side. James and Abigail sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide with wonder. "And there was your ma," Riley continued, his voice softening with reverence, "pale as moonlight but strong as steel, holding tiny Thomas like he was made of spun glass." "And you built the cradle," Thomas prompted. Knowing his role in the story, Riley nodded. "Worked through the night with nothing but determination and a borrowed axe. Wasn't much to look at, that cradle, but it did its job. For all of us," Sarah added proudly. She'd spent her infancy in that same cradle, as had her younger siblings. "And then you fell in love," Abigail piped up, always the romantic of the family. Julia reached across to take Riley's hand, the diamond on her finger catching the firelight. "We did," she confirmed. "Though neither of us was looking for it." "That's often how love finds you," Riley said, his eyes never leaving Julia's. "When you least expect it, in the middle of the storm." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Riley and Julia stood on their porch, looking out over the land they'd nurtured together. The same stars that had witnessed their unlikely beginning now shone down on all they'd built. "Any regrets?" Riley asked, his arm around her waist. Julia leaned into him, thinking of the lonely, terrified woman she'd been that stormy night, and the contented, loved woman she was now. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. Riley kissed her temple, still marveling at how fate had brought them together. "Me neither, not a single one." And as they stood there beneath the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the life they'd created together, both knew with absolute certainty that some storms bring not destruction, but the most unexpected blessings if you're brave enough to weather them and wise enough to recognize the gifts they leave behind.